Paddington takes to TV. Chapter 1. Paddington takes the cake. Paddington's won a prize in a Blue Peter competition? Mr. Brown lowered his newspaper and stared across the breakfast table. Don't look so surprised, Henry, said Mrs. Brown. He only heard this morning. There was a letter from the editor congratulating him, exclaimed Jonathan. And a super recipe for a Christmas cake from Val, added Judy. A Christmas cake? Mr. Brown looked for a moment as if his bacon and eggs had suddenly developed a horrible taste. I hope he's not going to try it out on us. I doubt if we shall be allowed within a mile of it, said Mrs. Brown reassuringly. It's all part of the competition. Apparently, the 6 winners have all been invited to bake a cake and take it along to the television studio. They all get a Christmas hamper, said Jonathan, but the one who makes the best cake gets a special prize of his own choice. That's a dangerous thing to say when Paddington's around, said Mr. Brown. If he wins, we shall be living on marmalade the rest of our lives. Val showed all the ingredients in a program some weeks ago, said Judy. There were some close-ups of the raisins and currants, and she asked the viewers to guess how many there were in each pile. Paddington was watching at the time, but I didn't dream he'd go in for it. Where's he going to make this cake? Asked Mr. Brown with interest. In the garden, if I have anything to do with it, broke in Mrs. Bird sternly. With memories of some of Paddington's previous attempts at cooking still fresh in her mind, the Browns' housekeeper intended putting her foot down at an early stage in the proceedings. I'm not having him in my kitchen. With Christmas just around the corner, I've enough to do as it is. Have some more toast, Henry, said Mrs. Brown, hastily changing the subject. In point of fact, only a few minutes before, she had offered Paddington the use of an old field kitchen, which Mr. Brown kept at the back of his shed, and normally only brought out when they went camping. But she had a nasty feeling in the back of her mind that her generous gesture might not meet with universal approval. I expect he'll find somewhere to do it, she said vaguely. You know Paddington. He usually does. He's that sort of bear. The door to the Browns' garage slowly opened, and a moment later, some familiar-looking whiskers, followed by an equally familiar hat, appeared in the gap as their owner stood peering round the garden with a guilty expression on his face. Having made sure that all was well, Paddington disappeared from view again, closing the doors behind him with a loud click. A few seconds later, a strange rumbling sound broke the stillness of the morning air. It was a sound not unlike that of an aircraft revving up its engines, and one which Mrs. Bird would have recognized immediately had she been there. But fortunately for her peace of mind, the Browns' housekeeper was busy helping the rest of the family finish off their Christmas shopping. However, if the noise outside the garage was loud, inside it was almost deafening. In fact, it was so loud that Paddington had to pull his hat well down over his ears in order to concentrate at all on the important-looking booklet he was trying to read. It was a small but brightly colored volume, and it was headed, Your Spin Dryer, Operating Instructions. Drawing up an old box, Paddington settled himself down, dipped his paw into a nearby jar of marmalade, and began to read. Gradually, however, his face dropped, and his whiskers began to sag, for although as a book it was quite interesting, he soon decided that, like most other instruction manuals he'd come across in the past, it dealt with practically every kind of situation except the one he wanted. The first 2 or 3 pages were devoted to telling the owner how lucky she was, and this was followed by a number of pictures showing a happy, laughing housewife standing beside a mountain of freshly dried sheets, while outside the kitchen window a storm appeared to be raging, and all her neighbors' washing hung limp and sodden on a line. Paddington went through the booklet several times in case he'd missed something by mistake. But although it devoted pages and pages to the drying of towels, sheets, blankets, woolens, and various other items, as far as he could make out, it didn't so much as mention the possibility of using the machine for making cakes of any sort, let alone Christmas ones. Giving vent to a loud sigh, he closed the book and turned his attention back to his immediate surroundings. When Val had demonstrated cake making on Blue Peter, it had all seemed remarkably easy, and she had left the studio looking spotlessly clean, with scarcely a trace of flour anywhere. Whereas, glancing around at the mess in Mr. Brown's garage, even Paddington had to admit that matters couldn't have been worse. Paddington didn't believe in doing things by halves, and he'd poured some extremely generous helpings of ingredients into Mrs. Brown's washing-up bowl, multiplying Val's instructions at least 6 times over before adding the milk and water with the aid of a watering can. It was when he'd come to stir the mixture that his troubles had started. Having bent several of Mrs. Bird's best spoons without even moving it, he tried his paw with Mr. Brown's electric paint stirrer instead. But even this device had begun to emit clouds of black smoke in protest, and when he'd withdrawn it hastily before it caught fire, it had suddenly burst into life again, scattering dough in all directions. It was then, when matters seemed at their lowest ebb, that he'd had the bright idea of using Mrs. Bird's spin dryer. Placing the instruction book carefully on one side before it got too many stains on its pages, Paddington crossed the garage to where the machine stood heaving and groaning in the middle of the floor. Turning it off at the wall switch, he waited while the drum inside slowed down and gradually came to a stop. Then he reached forward with a paw and cautiously lifted the lid. As he did so, Paddington suddenly stiffened, and for a moment he stood rooted to the spot, his eyes opening wider and wider. Then, after pinching himself several times in order to make sure he wasn't dreaming, he threw back the lid and peered inside the now silent machine. Admittedly, there were still a few traces of cake mixture left clinging to the sides of the drum, particularly around the edges of the holes which lined it. But apart from 1 or 2 of the larger chunks of fruit which he'd put in for luck, the main bulk of the cake had almost completely disappeared. Paddington rubbed his eyes and was about to consult the instruction booklet again, in case there was a section dealing with disappearing contents, when he felt something wet and sticky land on his foot. He glanced down and then nearly fell over backwards with astonishment, for there, sticking to his fur, was a large lump of the missing mixture. Worse still, from a pipe low down in the side of the machine, more was appearing with every passing second. After poking a screwdriver hopefully up the waste pipe, Paddington began taking the machine to pieces, while he considered ways and means of breaking the news to Mrs. Bird that several pounds of Christmas cake mixture was firmly lodged between the drum of her spin dryer and the outside case. Paddington wasn't the sort of bear who gave up easily in the face of difficulties. All the same, he looked most relieved when he'd gotten the machine back together again, particularly when he found he'd been able to salvage almost a bowlful of the cake mixture into the bargain. In her talk on Blue Peter, Val had mentioned having to bake her cake for a matter of several hours, but with time rapidly running out, Paddington decided not to take any chances, and after placing the bowl of mixture inside Mr. Brown's oven, which was really little more than a large metal box in the shape of a biscuit tin, he lit the burners underneath and carefully adjusted them to give the maximum amount of heat. Soon the smell of freshly baking cake began to waft across the garage, and he licked his lips in anticipation as he approached the oven in order to inspect his handiwork. In the past, Paddington had often noticed that one disaster was frequently followed by a second. Even so, with all his previous experience, he was still unprepared for the sight which met his eyes when he opened the oven door. Letting go of the handle, he collapsed onto the garage floor and stared at the oven with a mournful expression on his face. For the cake, far from looking golden brown and ready to ice like the one Val had shown on television, had risen so high and grown so wide it filled every nook and cranny, barely leaving room for the wisps of smoke it was giving off, let alone leaving space for anything to lever it out with. Paddington was accustomed to things looking black on the outside, but from where he was sitting, they looked unusually black on the inside as well. So black, he couldn't for the moment see even the faintest chink of light to relieve the gloom.